My parents forced us triplets to share pain until a 911 call exposed the basement. From the moment we were born, my parents preached a gospel no one else had heard. Triplets must remain equal in all things, not just in clothes or food or chores, but in pain. If Annabelle scraped her knee, Jane and I were lined up on the kitchen floor, forced to kneel until Dad pressed our legs against sandpaper until we bled the same. When Jane chipped a tooth, Mom made Annabelle and me bite down on metal spoons until our gums oozed. Every injury had to be matched, every scream balanced. They called it equal pain, equal bond. They believed suffering was the glue that would keep us together forever. The older we got, the more elaborate their science became. Dad built machines in the basement, contraptions with wires and dials that hummed when he flipped the switch. Mom kept meticulous notebooks columns, timestamps, charts comparing decibels of our screams. Perfect harmony, she'd say, when all three voices overlapped. By the time we were teenagers, pain was our language. A headache meant hours staring into strobe lights. Food poisoning, for one, meant vomit induced for all. I sometimes wondered if they actually loved us, or just loved the sound of synchronized agony. Then came the secret that cracked their system wide open. Annabelle got pregnant. At first she tried to hide it, terrified of what equality would mean now. But secrets never survived long in our house. Mom found the test buried in the trash. Instead of fury, her eyes lit up with something worse: excitement. "This," she whispered, stroking Annabelle's trembling cheek, "is the ultimate test of your bond." Within days, Dad strapped weighted sacks to Jane's and my bellies. Every month, he added more weight. "So you all carry the child together," he said proudly, scribbling notes as we stumbled under the burden. Mom forced us to swallow hormones that made us nauseous, bloated, exhausted. "Morning sickness must be shared," she insisted, her voice sharp with devotion. When Annabelle first felt the baby kick, Dad connected wires to Jane and me, jolting our stomachs with pulses that made our muscles spasm. "See?" he grinned. "Perfect symmetry." I learned to clench my jaw through the pain. But at night, I lay awake, pressing a hand to my belly that wasn't really swelling, whispering to myself, "This isn't real. This isn't motherhood. This is torture wearing a mask of love." Annabelle grew weaker. The baby pressed against her ribs, her body faltering under stress. Jane's wrists were raw from straps, and I began to dream not of escape, but of anyone seeing, through the walls of our silent house. The night Annabelle went into labor, Mom's voice shook with excitement. "Girls," she announced, "it's time!" Dad had already prepared the garage. 3 metal tables stood side by side under harsh lights, electrodes dangling like vines. He guided us onto them one by one, strapping down our wrists, tightening the buckles until leather cut into skin. Annabelle moaned as her first contraction hit. Dad turned the dial. Electricity surged through Jane and me, twisting our bodies into screams that matched hers. Mom clapped, tears shining in her eyes. "Perfect," she whispered. "Perfect bond." Hours blurred into torment. Annabelle writhed, blood staining the sheets. Jane thrashed beside me, her sobs ragged. My body convulsed with every pulse, the air thick with heat and iron. Then the midwife, a woman they'd brought in, a believer in natural births, leaned down and paled. "The baby's breech," she said quietly. "She needs a hospital." Dad shook his head, already reaching for scalpels. "Then we'll cut here. Equal cuts, equal births." He handed one to Mom, lifted his own above my stomach. I stared at the blade hovering inches above my skin, my breath trapped in my throat. Annabelle screamed, Jane sobbed, and in that moment, I truly believed this was how we die-stripped, strapped, synchronized into death. And then faint but rising, a sound cut through everything. Sirens. Mom's face drained of color. Dad froze, scalpel trembling. The midwife straightened, her hand brushing the phone, glowing faintly in her pocket. She had called for help. She had been feeding details through medical jargon all along. The sirens grew louder, closer, until they filled the night. For the first time in my life, the rhythm of our screams broke. The farther we were pulled from the world, the easier it was for them to convince us the basement was the only truth. Teachers had started asking about our matching bruises. So Mom pulled us from school. She told relatives we were too special for the system, that our condition required constant monitoring. She said it with conviction, like she was proud of us for being defective. The first weeks of homeschooling felt like freedom. No more awkward questions about the bandages on our arms. No more gym teachers raising eyebrows when all 3 of us limped on the same day. But freedom shrinks fast when every lesson is written in your parents' hand. History became stories of other triplets who lost their bond and died in despair. Science was Dad explaining nerve pathways while strapping us to machines to illustrate pain responses. Math was Mom calculating tolerance thresholds in neat columns while we gritted our teeth under her watchful eye. At 10, they sold our house in town and moved us to a property where the road ended in dirt and the trees pressed close like sentries. The nearest neighbor was miles away. "No distractions, no interferences," Mom said, spinning in the gravel driveway as if isolation itself were a gift. At night, the silence was so total, I could hear my own pulse in my ears. When the wind rattled the siding, it sounded like a whisper we couldn't quite decipher. Dad built more machines. He prowled hardware aisles with a gleam in his eye, seeing not tools, but instruments. He rigged up a contraption with strobes that flickered in our faces when Annabelle complained of migraines. He set up headphones blasting white noise so loud my skull vibrated. He designed belts with weights that cinched across our chest to mimic shortness of breath. When Jane got food poisoning, Mom poured syrup of ipecac down my throat and held a bucket steady while I vomited until my ribs felt like they'd split. She rubbed my back gently, cooing, "There, now you're equal." The basement grew crowded with Dad's inventions: metal frames, leather straps, wires that hummed faintly even when unplugged. Each one had a name scribbled in Sharpie: pain parity rig, bond harmonizer, symmetry helm. He documented everything like a scientist, but the experiments were always us. We began to measure life in calibrations. Dad would twist a dial and say, "Tell me when the pain matches." I'd look at Jane's face, twisted and wet with tears, then at Annabelle's clenched jaw, and I'd whisper, "Now." He'd note the setting in his logbook, satisfied. There were moments we tried to rebel. We whispered escape plans under blankets, drew maps on scraps of notebook paper, saved coins from the grocery money Mom gave us. Jane was the bravest. She found ways to sneak onto the neighbor's Wi-Fi half a mile down the road, crouching in the tall grass with her phone clutched to her chest, selling beaded bracelets she made in secret. She hid the cash in a hollow under the baseboard. She believed in roads that led somewhere else. By 15, we had nearly enough for bus tickets. Annabelle cried every night, terrified we'd get caught. But Jane and I kept reassuring her, "We'll make it." Just a few more weeks, I held the dream like a lifeline, stepping onto a bus, city lights rushing past, becoming someone whose gauge wasn't measured in welts. The night we tried, the air smelled of diesel and fried food at the station. We stood there clutching our backpacks, shaking with fear and hope, watching other families line up for trips to anywhere but here. For the first time in years, I thought, maybe this ends. But Dad's hand clamped on my neck before we reached the ticket counter. He'd installed trackers in our shoes, tiny chips that pinged his phone when we crossed the property line. "Equal pain, equal bond," he said through gritted teeth as he herded us back to the car. His voice wasn't proud this time. It was furious. The punishment was fire. He laid out metal bowls, filled them with coals until they glowed orange. The smell of smoke curled into my nose, sharp and oily. "Hold them," he ordered. Mom kissed our foreheads as if to bless us. I cupped the coal with both hands. The searing pain stole my breath before the scream even formed. Beside me, Jane's sobs cracked. Annabelle's body buckled. Blisters rose like pale moons across our palms. Mom whispered through it all, "You will never be hurt alone." Isn't that beautiful? Afterward, they wrapped our hands in gauze and fed us soup, humming lullabies. I hated that my body still craved their comfort, even as my palms throbbed. That's the trick of cruelty, wrapped in love. You never know which you're swallowing until it's too late. We stopped trying to run. Not because we gave up, but because failure taught us how far their reach extended. They didn't need chains when every step was watched. We learned to survive in small ways. By sharing looks, by holding each other's hands under the table, by whispering apologies after punishments. Sometimes at night, I dreamed of windows. In the dream, glass opened onto streets filled with people who didn't know what equal pain meant. I'd wake with my fist clenched around nothing, my heart pounding like it was trying to escape my ribs. By 17, the rules of our prison shifted. The word pregnancy began to appear in Mom's notes. Dad scribbled diagrams of wombs and birth canals, talking about the ultimate experiment. I didn't understand at first. I thought it was theory, another one of their obsessions. But Annabelle's late-night trips to the bathroom grew longer, her face paler, her eyes haunted. When she finally showed us the plus sign on the test, her hands trembled like a leaf in wind. We begged her to hide it, but secrets never lasted in that house. The day Mom found the test, she didn't scream. She gasped in delight, clapping her hands like a child on Christmas morning. "This is it," she whispered, eyes wet. "The ultimate test of your bond." And for the first time, I realized what we thought was hell had only been rehearsal. When Annabelle's secret slipped into Mom's hands and the world tilted. For months, my sister had carried the weight of 2 heartbeats, her own, and the one fluttering inside her while pretending nothing had changed. She'd whisper to me late at night, palm over her belly, "Do you think it knows? Do you think it's safe?" I never knew how to answer. The morning Mom found the test, she didn't rage. She radiated joy, the kind that chilled me worse than anger ever could. She lifted the little plastic stick like it was a holy relic. "This," she breathed, eyes shining, "is the ultimate test of your bond. Motherhood, shared perfectly. Equal pain, equal life." Dad's smile was slower, more deliberate. He ran a thumb along the test window, studying it as though it were data. "We can design for this," he said, already calculating. "Morning sickness, weight gain, fetal kicks. We can simulate all of it." His gaze swept over Jane and me, measuring our bodies like materials for an experiment. That night, the regimen began. At breakfast, Mom slipped 3 identical pills onto our plates. Annabelle looked confused until Mom said softly, "Prenatals for her, hormones for you. We'll need your cycles aligned." Jane hesitated, but Dad's look was enough. We swallowed. Within days, my stomach clenched with nausea so fierce I could barely stand. Annabelle cried when she saw us retching beside her, whispering, "I never wanted this for you." I held her hair back and lied, "It's not your fault." The weights came next. Canvas sacks filled with sand, strapped across our bellies with rough Velcro. 1/2 pound at first, then 1 pound, then 2. By the end of the week, my spine curved under the strain. "You'll carry together," Mom said, tightening the straps until my ribs protested. No child of mine will ever feel alone. When Annabelle felt her baby's first flutter, Dad pressed electrodes against my stomach and Jane's, securing them with sticky pads. He held a small remote like a conductor's baton. Tell me when it matches. He clicked, and my abdomen spasmed with a violent kick of electricity. I gasped, doubled over, tears spilling. Across the room, Jane screamed. Dad adjusted the dial until Annabelle nodded weakly through her own real kick. There, she whispered, voice trembling. That's what it felt like. Dad grinned like a scientist who'd cracked a code. The garage became their altar. They cleared out tools and lawn equipment, stringing up harsh surgical lights. 3 beds stood side by side, Annabelle's fitted with stirrups, ours with leather restraints. Machines lined the walls, tangled wires, humming generators, clamps, and monitors that blinked like watchful eyes. The air smelled of antiseptic and motor oil. The midwife visited once, a woman with iron gray hair and eyes too bright. She shook Mom's hands with both of them. You're brave, she said, almost reverent. Most families would run from this truth. But you're preserving the sacred bond. She ran her hands over Annabelle's belly, nodding approvingly at Dad's blueprints. Alternative birthing is about community, about symmetry. She never looked at the electrodes taped to my skin.
At night, Annabelle would curl against me, sobbing. I don't want them to hurt her, she whispered, touching her stomach. I don't want them to hurt him. She never said baby, only her or him, like giving it a name made it more vulnerable. I pressed my forehead to hers, whispering back, I'll protect you. I promise. The words tasted like ash because I knew protection was impossible. Jane stopped speaking much. She kept her eyes down, lips pressed tight, carrying her fake pregnancy with a fury she couldn't release.
I'd catch her staring at her weighted belly in the mirror, fists clenched, whispering curses at her reflection. One night, I found her digging into the hollow under the baseboard again. She pulled out a wad of damp bills, counted them with trembling fingers, then shoved them back. Not enough, she muttered. Never enough. She didn't look at me when she added, if the baby comes, we'll never get out. Mom updated the logs daily. She measured our weight gain, charted our nausea, timed our contractions when Dad hooked us up to the stimulation rigs. She praised us for symmetry, scolded us when our cries were out of sync. Remember, she said, pressing her pen to the clipboard, your harmony is your strength. You'll thank us someday. I used to think hell was fire. But hell can be fluorescent lights humming overhead, the smell of sweat and metal, your sister's sobs echoing yours because neither of you is allowed to have your own body. The night Annabelle's labor began, the sky outside was sharp with stars, cold and merciless. She doubled over in the kitchen, gripping the counter, moaning. Mom gasped, eyes wide like a child opening a gift. It's time, she whispered, trembling. It's finally time. Dad was already moving, gathering equipment, checking straps. Girls, to the garage. Hurry! His voice was electric with anticipation. Annabelle stumbled forward, clutching her belly. Jane and I flanked her, our weighted sacks slamming against our hips. Every step felt like walking into fire. The garage door yawned open, flooding us with harsh white light. 3 beds waited, straps unbuckled, machines humming, electrodes already warming. Mom's voice rang out, breathless with devotion. Equal pain, equal birth. The perfect test of your bond. And I knew whatever happened that night, none of us would leave unchanged. The garage had always been Dad's domain, oil stains on the floor. Shelves lined with tools he insisted only he knew how to use. A smell of rust and gasoline that clung to his clothes. But that night, it wasn't a workshop. It was a chapel. Harsh surgical lamps hung from the rafters, their white glow bleaching every shadow into absence. 3 beds stood side by side, one draped in a crisp white sheet with stirrups gleaming at the end. The other 2 outfitted with leather straps at wrists, ankles, and chest. On the far wall, machines hummed low, blinking with green and red lights like mechanical sentries. Wires coiled across the concrete floor in serpentine tangles. Mom's eyes glistened as she guided Annabelle to the bed in the middle. This is holy, she whispered, voice trembling as if she were standing before an altar. All 3 of you, bringing life together. Perfect symmetry. Annabelle collapsed onto the sheet, sweat plastering her hair to her temples. She clutched my hand like it was the only tether holding her in this world. Jane and I were shoved toward our beds. Dad's hands were steady, efficient, as he buckled straps across my chest, tightening until the leather bit into my skin. Relax, he murmured, like a surgeon soothing a patient. You'll thank us. The electrodes came next. Cold pads slapped against my stomach, my thighs, my shoulders. Dad adjusted each one with precision, taping the wires so they wouldn't shift when I thrashed. When the machine beeped ready, he held up the remote control, his thumb hovering over the button like a conductor waiting for the downbeat. Annabelle moaned through her first contraction, her face twisting. Mom clapped her hands in delight. Now, she urged. Dad pressed the button. Gunny detonated through me. My abdomen clenched with a violence that ripped a scream out of my throat. Across the room, Jane cried out. Our voices rose with Annabelle's strained groan, until the 3 sounds blended into one unsettling harmony. The machine beeped in response, steady and calm, as if approving our synchronization. Mom's voice floated above it, reverent and controlled. Beautiful, perfectly aligned. She scribbled notes on her clipboard, her eyes shining with something close to pride. The contraction eased, leaving me trembling. My body went limp against the restraints, and sweat trickled into my eyes. Annabelle gasped for breath, her knuckles white on the bed rails. Jane's chest lifted in shallow bursts, her eyes unfocused, yet burning with fury. Minutes dragged. Each contraction struck harder. Each electrical surge tore through me, locking my muscles until I thought my bones might break. My throat ached from the cries that escaped me. But Dad only urged me on. Good. Yes, keep the pitch. The bond must hold. I forced my gaze on Annabelle, on her chest rising, on her eyes flicking toward me with a silent plea. Don't leave me alone in this. And I whispered back between clenched teeth. I'm here. I'm here. The midwife stood in the corner, her expression unreadable. She checked Annabelle's dilation with brisk efficiency, then stepped back, folding her arms. She didn't look at me or Jane, strapped down and convulsing under manufactured pain. She looked only at Annabelle, nodding occasionally, murmuring, progressing well. Her voice was calm, almost detached, as if we weren't all trapped in this grotesque parody of labor. Hours blurred, sweat pooled beneath me, soaking into the thin sheet. My wrist bled where the straps rubbed raw. Jane's face turned gray, her lips cracked from screaming. Annabelle moaned and whimpered, her contractions coming closer, her body bowing with effort. Somewhere between one surge and the next, I felt my mind split. Part of me floated above the scene, watching 3 girls in parallel beds, machines whirring, parents scribbling notes like scientists at an experiment. Another part of me remained trapped inside my body, nerves on fire, lungs clawing for air. Ask yourself, if the people who raised you strapped you down in the name of love, would you call it devotion or damnation? At one point, Annabelle cried out, "Stop, please, it hurts." But her plea only delighted Mom more. Yes, that's the bond speaking. Don't fight it, sweetheart. Let it join you. The next contraction hit harder. The machine's pulse slammed through me. I arched, vision splintering white. I heard Jane sobbing, Annabelle gasping, Dad muttering numbers under his breath as he adjusted dials. The world narrowed to the sound of our combined suffering. When the contraction finally ended, I sagged against the restraints, chest heaving, tears dripping into my ears. Through the blur, I saw Annabelle's belly tighten again, another wave building. Mom leaned forward, almost giddy. It's time, again. All together now, and as Dad lifted his thumb over the button, I realized with a clarity that cut deeper than the pain. This was only the beginning. Annabelle's moans had shifted. They weren't just contractions anymore. They were edged with something darker, sharper. Her face was ashen, lips cracked, sweat dripping down her neck. The midwife checked between her legs, and for the first time that night, her calm cracked. Her brow furrowed. She looked at my parents. "The baby is breech," she said. Her voice carried a note of urgency she hadn't shown before. "We need to get her to a hospital. A C-section might be necessary." For a heartbeat, silence filled the garage, broken only by the steady hum of Dad's machines. Mom clutched her clipboard to her chest, eyes wide. Then she shook her head. "No hospital," she whispered, almost frantic. That would ruin everything. They wouldn't let the bond hold. Dad didn't hesitate. He crossed to his tool cabinet, pulled open a drawer, and laid 3 identical scalpels on the tray with a metallic clatter. His hands were steady, his eyes lit with feverish determination. "If one gets cut open, they all get cut open," he said, as though it were the most obvious truth in the world. Equal cuts, equal depth, perfect synchronization. I froze. My chest tightened so hard I thought I'd suffocate. The straps dug into my wrists as I struggled, panic flooding me in waves. Jane screamed toward the air. "No, you can't! She'll die!" Mom rushed to her side, pressed a hand against her cheek, and whispered, almost soothing, "Sweetheart, you must be brave. This is how we keep you together." She lifted one of the scalpels, testing the weight in her hand like a pianist finding middle C. Dad positioned himself beside me, blade glinting under the harsh white light. His hand shook slightly, sweat dotting his forehead, but his eyes burned with purpose. "This is necessary," he murmured. "It's the only way to preserve balance." Annabelle cried out again, clutching the rails, tears streaking her face. "Please," she gasped, voice raw. "Don't hurt them. Just help me." The midwife hovered near her, frozen, eyes darting between my parents' and Annabelle's laboring body. She looked like a woman caught between her faith in alternative birth and the dawning horror that this was no ritual, no sacred symmetry, this was madness. Dad lowered the scalpel until the cold steel hovered just above my skin. I could feel its chill, smell the faint tang of disinfectant mixed with sweat. My body went rigid. I wanted to scream, to beg, but my throat locked. The room seemed to tilt, time thickening like molasses. Jane thrashed in her restraints, kicking so violently her bed rattled against the concrete. "You're insane," she shouted, voice cracking. "You're going to kill us." Mom's smile faltered for the first time. The scalpel in her hand trembled. She looked at Dad, eyes wide, searching. "What if we go too deep?" she whispered. "What if—" "Then we start over," Dad snapped, his voice sharp, final. His grip tightened on the scalpel handle. Annabelle's scream split the air, raw and animal. The midwife bent over her, then straightened suddenly, her face pale. She's losing too much blood, she said firmly, louder now. The baby's heart rate is dropping. If you don't get her to a hospital now, they'll both die. For a moment, something flickered in Mom's expression. Fear, hesitation. Even she couldn't pretend death was part of the plan. Dad didn't waver. He brought the scalpel lower, close enough that the blade almost kissed my skin. I held my breath, heart pounding so hard it rattled my ribs. And then, beep! The sound was shrill, electronic, slicing through the room. The electrode on my shoulder had slipped free, sliding off with my sweat. The machine blared an alarm. Dad cursed, dropping the scalpel back onto the tray with a metallic clink. He rushed to the machine, muttering angrily about cheap adhesive, fumbling to stick the electrode back onto my slick skin. Those seconds, those precious, stuttering seconds, were enough. I caught the midwife's gaze, mouthed the words, "She'll die." My eyes flicked to Annabelle, pale and trembling, her cries weakening. The midwife's face went rigid, all color draining. For the first time, I saw real fear in her eyes. She leaned closer to Annabelle, pretended to check dilation, and whispered something I couldn't hear. Then she raised her voice, speaking to the room. "We need to stop now. We can't risk it." Mom shook her head violently, tears spilling. No, this is sacred. We can't stop." Dad slapped the machine in frustration, the electrode refusing to stick. He looked up, eyes blazing. We finished what we started. The scalpel gleamed again in his hand. And that was when I knew. The only thing standing between us and his blade was the midwife and whatever decision she made in the next breath. The electrode's alarm still wailed, a shrill cry that cut through the garage. Dad slapped the machine again, muttering curses, sweat dripping into his eyes. His focus was split between the scalpel glinting in his hand and the blinking panel that refused to obey. The midwife used the chaos. She leaned over Annabelle, hand steady, her expression calm for anyone watching. But I saw the twitch of her fingers, the way she angled her body to shield her pocket. Her hand slipped inside, and when she drew it back, her phone screen glowed faintly against the white sheet. She bent closer to Annabelle and whispered so softly I almost thought I imagined it. "I've called. Scream louder." Annabelle's eyes widened. She let out a guttural cry, raw enough to rattle the lights overhead. Her voice filled every corner of the garage, covering the faint click of the call connecting. The midwife straightened, projecting professionalism. "Hemorrhaging risk," she barked, her voice sharp, directed at Dad. "We need a surgical team now." At the same time, she kept talking loudly, clinically about dilation, fetal distress, and uterine rupture. Words chosen carefully. Words meant to feed down a phone line she never acknowledged was open. Mom scribbled notes frantically, her lips moving with her chant. Equal pain, equal bond. Her eyes were wild, red-rimmed, desperate to preserve the illusion that this was sacred, not grotesque. Dad gave up on the faulty electrode, yanked it from my chest, and shoved a new one against my skin. He flipped a switch. Electricity tore through me, folding my body into itself. My scream merged with Jane's, with Annabelle's labor cry, into a cacophony that shook the air. Mom clapped her hands in rhythm, tears running down her face. "Perfect!" she shouted over us. Perfect harmony. But beneath the shrieks, I heard something else. At first faint, like a sound carried by memory rather than air. Then stronger, sirens wailing in the distance. The midwife's gaze flicked to me. A warning? A promise? I couldn't tell. She raised her voice, louder, more precise. "Oxygen deprivation, severe distress emergency intervention required immediately." Her words were a beacon, cutting through the chaos, feeding the invisible ears on the other end of her phone. Dad adjusted the dials again, chasing symmetry, obsessed with synchronization. He didn't hear the sirens, or maybe he thought they were just echoes of our screams. Jane's wrist bled against the straps, raw and slick. She gasped. "We're going to die here." Her voice shredded to a whisper. I turned my head, forcing my eyes to meet hers, even as my body convulsed under the current. "No," I rasped, throat raw. "Not tonight." Another contraction gripped Annabelle. She arched, veins standing out on her neck. The machine pulsed again, locking me in agony, my scream spilling into hers. The sound no longer felt human. It was animal, primal, an unholy chorus of suffering. And still, through the cacophony, the sirens drew closer, louder, clearer. Dad froze mid-adjustment, his head cocked. For the first time, doubt shadowed his face. "Do you hear that?" he asked, voice tight. Mom didn't look up from her notes. "It's their voices. The bond is pure. Don't lose focus." But the sirens were undeniable now, swelling like a tide, vibrating the walls of the garage. The midwife didn't flinch. She pressed harder on Annabelle's belly, pretending to monitor progress. Under her breath, she whispered again, almost too soft to catch. "Hold on. Just hold on." And in that moment, strapped to a bed, body burning with pain, I realized help was already on the road. The sirens swelled until the walls themselves seemed to vibrate. Tires screeched on gravel outside, headlights slicing through the cracks around the garage door. Dad's hand froze on the control dial, his jaw tightening. For the first time all night, the manic certainty in his eyes flickered into panic. Mom's head snapped up, clipboard trembling in her hands. "No!" she shrieked, her voice cracking. "They can't interrupt. If they break the bond now, everything will unravel." Her words tangled into sobs, but her grip on the scalpel didn't loosen. The garage door rattled violently as fists pounded from the outside. Sheriff's Department, open the door! The voice was deep, commanding, impossible to ignore. Dad lunged toward the power switch, intent on erasing evidence. But Jane thrashed in her restraints, jerking her bed so hard it blocked his path. Stay away, she screamed, blood from her wrist streaking the sheets. The midwife didn't move to stop the officers. She stood tall beside Annabelle, one hand still pressed against her belly, the other clutching her hidden phone. She's losing blood, she shouted toward the door. Hurry! With a deafening crack, the garage door buckled upward, metal screeching as it was forced open. Flashlights cut through the harsh surgical light, beams sweeping across the nightmare tableau, 3 girls strapped to beds, wires snaking across the floor, scalpels glinting, blood-soaking gauze. Step away from the machines, the sheriff barked, his gun drawn. Deputies fanned out behind him, hands hovering near holsters. Dad raised his arms, palms out, his voice smooth but frantic. This is a private medical procedure. You have no jurisdiction here. The sheriff's eyes scanned the room, landing on me, on Jane, on Annabelle, convulsing with another contraction. His jaw clenched. Shut it down, now. Dad made a desperate move toward the control panel, but a deputy tackled him hard to the concrete, the scalpel clattering out of his grip. He struggled, shouting about balance and symmetry until his face was pressed to the floor, cuffs locking around his wrists. Mom dropped her clipboard, paper scattering like confetti. She lunged toward Annabelle's bed, wailing, Don't let them break the bond! Don't let them steal this! Her voice cracked into hysterics as 2 deputies grabbed her arms, dragging her back. She kicked, screamed, and sobbed, her cries echoing against the metal walls. You'll kill them if you separate them! They need me. They'll die without me. The sheriff didn't look at her. His focus was on us. Get those girls loose, he ordered. Hands swarmed my restraints, leather unbuckling, wires being yanked away. The moment my wrists were freed, I curled into myself, shaking so violently my teeth clattered. A paramedic knelt at my side murmuring, You're safe now? We've got you. Across the room, Jane sobbed as her straps came undone. Her arms were mottled with bruises, her skin raw where leather had bitten. She collapsed into the arms of another paramedic, clinging like she'd drown if he let go. Annabelle cried out again, her face chalk white, her belly heaving. The midwife waved frantically. She's hemorrhaging! We need transport now! 2 paramedics rushed to her, lifting her gently onto a stretcher. Blood stained the sheet beneath her, dark and spreading. Annabelle's eyes fluttered, her lips forming my name before rolling back into her head. Go, go, go! The sheriff shouted. The stretcher wheeled out, paramedics shouting vitals into radios, red and blue lights strobing against the open door. As they passed, I reached for Annabelle's hand. My fingers brushed hers for half a second, cold and limp, before she was swept into the night. Jane clutched me, her body trembling against mine. For the first time, there were no electrodes, no straps, no forced screams. Just the 2 of us, holding each other, free but broken. Behind us, Mom's screams rose higher, shrill and desperate. They'll never survive without me. You're dooming them. Deputies dragged her toward a waiting cruiser, her body thrashing like a trapped animal. Dad lay face down, cuffed, blood pooling from a gash on his cheek where he'd hit the floor. His eyes burned with rage, but there was something else there too, emptiness. The sheriff crouched near us, his face softening. You're safe now, he said quietly. No one's going to hurt you again. But as the flashing lights painted the night, and Annabelle's stretcher disappeared into the ambulance, I wondered if safety was even possible anymore. Because even without the straps, I still felt the phantom burn of the wires. And Mom's words, "You'll die without me," echoed in my head like a curse I wasn't sure we could shake. The ambulance rocked as it sped down the country road, sirens screaming overhead. I sat wedged between 2 paramedics, wires and electrodes still stuck to my skin, the smell of burned flesh clinging to me. Jane was in the second rig behind us, and Annabelle, my Annabelle, was already unconscious in the first, blood soaking the stretcher. When we reached the hospital, the fluorescent lights blinded me. Nurses swarmed, their voices a blur of medical jargon. Hands guided me onto a gurney, scissors snipping straps and tape from my skin. For the first time in years, I was being touched without malice, but my body didn't know the difference. I flinched at every hand, every voice, every shadow crossing my vision. Separate them, one doctor said briskly, pointing Jane down a different hall. My heart lurched. We'd never been apart, never slept in different rooms, never eaten alone, never walked into silence without the other 2 beside us. No, I cried, thrashing weakly against the nurse's grip. Please, we can't. It's for your safety, the nurse said, her voice firm but kind. You'll see her again soon. Right now, you need care. The door shut, leaving me alone. Alone in a way that felt like dying. They hooked me to monitors, took pictures of my wrists, my burned skin, my bruised chest. A camera flashed, documenting every scar, every welt. One nurse whispered to another, "How long?" The other shook her head, lips pressed thin. A woman introduced herself as Dr. Julia Abernathy. She crouched so our eyes met. Her voice was steady, anchoring. "I'm the surgeon for your sister. I'll do everything I can to save her and the baby." The words blurred in my ears. Save her, save the baby. For a moment, I forgot how to breathe. Hours passed. Nurses came and went, asking questions I couldn't answer. Medical history? Only what Mom had written in her logbooks. Allergies? Unknown. Last tetanus shot? Silence. I'd been alive 17 years and had no record outside those basement notebooks. Through the thin walls, I heard Jane sobbing somewhere down the hall, her voice cracking on my name. I screamed for her until my throat bled, but no one brought her to me. The separation was its own torture. Meanwhile, Annabelle's surgery dragged on. The clock ticked past midnight, each second an iron weight pressing against my ribs. At one point, a nurse slipped into my room and squeezed my hand. "They're still working," she said softly. "Don't give up hope." Hope. The word felt foreign, heavy. When Dr. Abernathy finally returned, her scrubs were stained, her hair damp with sweat. She sank onto the stool beside my bed. "Your sister's alive," she said first, her voice careful. "The baby too. They're both critical, but stable. We're moving the baby to the NICU. Annabelle will be in recovery for several hours." My body crumpled, relief and exhaustion colliding. I sobbed until my lungs burned. Later, a woman in a blazer entered, carrying a clipboard. She introduced herself as a social worker. "Protective custody," she said. "Emergency housing. Trauma recovery." The words felt too big, like puzzle pieces that didn't fit in my head. She explained that our parents had been arrested, that police had found notebooks, devices, hard drives in the house, evidence enough to charge them with torture and attempted murder. I barely heard her. My thoughts looped only one thing. Annabelle's alive. The baby's alive. By morning, reporters swarmed outside the hospital. News vans lined the street, cameras flashing. Nurses whispered about the torture triplets, shaking their heads in disbelief. A security guard stationed himself at my door, turning away anyone without clearance. When Jane was finally wheeled into my room, I nearly ripped my IV out trying to reach her. We clung together, crying, our bodies shaking so hard the bed rattled. She kept whispering, "I thought they'd take you away. I thought we'd never..." But for the first time in years, no one forced us apart. Hours later, a nurse brought us down a quiet hallway. Through the window, we saw Annabelle lying pale and unconscious, her belly bandaged, machines humming around her. Beside her, in a plastic incubator, the tiniest baby I'd ever seen twitched a fist, wires taped to her chest. A nurse smiled gently. "She's strong." Stronger than she looks, I pressed my hand against the glass of the incubator, tears blurring my vision. For the first time, I whispered her name, not the baby's, but a word we'd carried in secret, the only thing we'd dared to hope for. Freedom. By the time dawn broke, our story was no longer ours. It belonged to the world. Through the narrow hospital blinds, I saw the flashing logos of news vans, their antennas piercing the sky like metal thorns. Reporters huddled by the entrance, microphones ready, their breath fogging in the morning chill. The words "torture triplets" scrolled across a muted television bolted to the wall in my room. Beneath it, a banner read, "Parents arrested in equality experiment, horror." Jane sat beside me, her knees pulled to her chest, eyes locked on the screen. Every time our last name flashed, she flinched. "That's not who we are," she whispered. "That's not us." But it was, at least to them. Detectives came in with laptops and questions. They showed us photographs. Dad's machines lined up like monsters in the basement. Mom's notebooks stacked in towers. Spreadsheets tracking our pain responses with the cold precision of science experiments. Charts documenting blisters, burns, extracted teeth. I couldn't look too long before my stomach lurched. One officer muttered, 17 years. Every injury logged like it was homework. His jaw was tight, his knuckles white against the folder he carried. Another detective, younger, less guarded, asked gently, "Did they ever say why?" Jane answered in a hollow voice, "Because triplets should be equal. Equal pain, equal bond." That's what they said. The officer shook his head. "Equal suffering doesn't make you bonded. It makes you prisoners outside," the media speculated. Anchors dissected our lives as if we were characters in a show. They wondered why no one had noticed, how neighbors never suspected, whether homeschooling was a cover for abuse. They used words like house of horrors and basement of pain. The midwife's name surfaced too. Some networks painted her as complicit, others as the savior who dialed 911. None of them knew the whole truth, that she had hovered between belief and fear, between loyalty and betrayal, until the last possible second. At night, when the hospital halls quieted, I scrolled through articles on a nurse's phone she'd lent me. There were already opinion pieces debating whether my parents were insane or evil, whether their obsession was delusion or design. People online speculated about us, the survivors dissecting our photographs, inventing theories about what scars we carried, inside and out. Some comments were kind, "Stay strong. We believe you." Others dripped with cruelty. "They're exaggerating. It can't have been that bad. They look fine in the pictures." As if a camera could capture 17 years of pain. Annabelle drifted in and out of consciousness in the recovery ward. Every time her eyes opened, she asked the same two questions. "The baby?" and "Are we still together?" Nurses reassured her about the baby. Jane and I reassured her about us. But I couldn't bring myself to tell her about the world outside the headlines. The strangers debating her child's future like it was entertainment. The detective said the evidence was overwhelming. Dozens of hard drives filled with recordings. Thousands of pages of notes. Even animals in the early years, pigs, rabbits used for Dad's tests. A lifetime of obsession cataloged in ink and pixels. This case will make history, one investigator told me, almost in awe. But to me, history wasn't the point. Survival was. Ask yourself, if every detail of your suffering was suddenly broadcast to millions, would you feel rescued or robbed? When Annabelle was stable enough, they wheeled her into a secure room with us. The baby remained in the NICU, tiny and fragile, a living contradiction to all the cruelty we'd endured. Annabelle reached for our hands with trembling fingers. "We're free," she whispered. Her voice cracked, but there was a fragile smile on her lips. "Aren't we?" Jane nodded, though tears streaked her face. I squeezed Annabelle's hand, staring at the baby through the glass, and thought, freedom doesn't erase chains. It just changes their shape. The world thought our story ended with rescue. They didn't know it was only beginning. 2 weeks after the raid, the hospital discharged us into a different kind of custody. Not our parents, never again, but the states. Social workers shuffled us into an apartment with locks on every door and guards stationed in the lobby. They called it protective housing. To me, it felt like another cage, except this time, the people holding the keys swore they were helping. Court came quickly. The world wanted answers, and prosecutors moved fast. Our parents were led in wearing orange jumpsuits, wrists shackled. The sight of them, once so omnipotent, now diminished, should have brought relief. Instead, my stomach twisted. Mom looked around the courtroom as though searching for us, her eyes fever bright. When she saw Jane and me on the bench, she smiled through cracked lips, mouthed, "Bond forever." I turned away, bile rising in my throat. Dad stood straighter, chin lifted, as if the chains were a formality beneath him. His lawyer painted him as a visionary who'd misunderstood psychological research. A man sick, not evil. They spoke of his devotion to symmetry, of his obsessive-compulsive framework, words meant to soften the edges of torture. The prosecutor countered with photographs, my wrists raw from straps, Jane's blistered palms, Annabelle's pale body strapped between electrodes while in labor. The images silenced the room. When the judge asked for their pleas, both said, "Not guilty." The words rang like betrayal, though I should have expected nothing else. Bail hearings followed. Mom's lawyer argued she wasn't a flight risk, that she just wanted to care for her daughters. The prosecutor played the 911 recording. The whole court heard the midwife describing 3 teenage girls strapped to tables, while Mom's voice wailed about equal pain. The judge's face hardened with each word. He set bail at $2 million, no contact allowed. Dad's was higher. Neither could pay. The midwife became a wild card. One day, complicit, the next, a savior. Prosecutors cut her a deal. Testify against our parents in exchange for a suspended license and probation. She accepted, eyes down, voice trembling as she signed the papers. Jane whispered, coward, under her breath. But I wasn't sure. Without her, we'd be dead. With her, we were survivors. Detectives prepared us for testimony. "You don't have to face them," one officer said. "We can do video depositions, or we can use the evidence without you." But prosecutors wanted our voices, our words, the raw truth no photograph could capture. Annabelle shook her head. She was still too weak, stitches pulling at her belly, her baby in the NICU. Jane flat out refused. "I won't give them my voice," she hissed. That left me. The thought of standing in that courtroom, speaking about coal burns and forced vomit, about electrodes and scalpels, made my throat tighten until I gagged. But part of me thought, if I don't speak, they'll twist it. They'll say it wasn't that bad. Nights were the worst. News anchors debated whether our parents were monsters or mad. Strangers online posted comments about us, our photos, our scars, even the baby. People speculated about whether Annabelle's child would carry trauma in her blood. It felt like we'd escaped one prison only to be thrown into another made of cameras and microphones. Still, the trial loomed. The prosecutor warned it could last months, maybe a year. She promised us protection, therapy, safe housing. But she couldn't promise peace. Ask yourself, what would you do if the people who ruined you still had the power to make you speak in their defense? The night before the preliminary hearing, I lay awake in the dark apartment, Jane curled beside me, Annabelle snoring softly in the other room, the baby's monitor beeping faintly. I stared at the ceiling and whispered to myself, they won't win? Not this time. But even as I said it, I felt the phantom sting of electrodes on my skin, the echo of Mom's chant, equal pain, equal bond. And I wondered if the courtroom would free us or bind us to them forever. Thanks for staying with me through this. If this story shook you, drop a like and subscribe. It helps more than you know. I'll see you in the next one.